I think some more people will be joining us as we go on, but we don't want to tie everybody up. So this is an ongoing seminar series for the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. We're very fortunate to have one of the originators and continues to be a leader, thought leader in ecological economics, as well as post-normative science. Post-normal science is what I was trying to say. Silvio Funtowicz from the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen in Norway. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Silvio. Thank you very much for doing this for us.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for those who are joining at noon, most of probably. I'm here at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. So I will share my screen, and let's see if I can select. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted, I'm not going to talk about this, but I just wanted to, for younger people, that have a historic picture. And this is the first conference of ecological economics in 1990, and in White Island, and perhaps you recognize some of the people. Some of them, unfortunately, are no longer with us. You could see Herman Daly and Kenneth Boulding, and I'm on the, well, for you it will be on the left with, with dark glasses, and I'm there, and then behind me is Joan Martinez Allier, a name I'm sure you recognize. This is just to establish my credentials, and because I was one of the founder members of ecological economics in 1987 in a meeting in Barcelona. Okay, and it has been important. I'm not active in ecological economics, but through some of my friends I met during 1987 and 1990, they have a great influence on what I'm going to talk to you. And an early version of what I'm going to talk, I presented at the conference in 1990, and it is in the volume of the first conference. So I will now start with what I want to talk to you. And I hope you'll find it interesting, and I will try to stay inside the time so we can have a conversation after. Okay, that's the first, and the subject I'm going to address is the many voices of knowledge. For those who follow the, for example, the International Panel on Biodiversity, perhaps you have seen recently the articles in Nature and so on, about precisely the notion about the plurality of notions of knowledge and cultures and values. Valuation. As you know, valuation was a very important subject in ecological economics. It started with a critique of quantitative or monetary valuation, and from then on, well, we follow. So what I wanted to talk to you is precisely the idea about how can we start putting into practice and the idea of the many voices of knowledge. Now, I will start with something. Well, we all became experts on COVID, I think. So the first slide, it is in Italian, but I did it on purpose. I left it as it is, but substantially during the COVID pandemic, 1921, an expert, an immunologist that was member of the committee advising the government on what to do, said that science has to apologize to the Italian people because it was unable to speak with one voice. So in a sense, the title of my presentation relates precisely to this. The idea is, can or should science speak with one voice? Now, almost at the same time, there is another person, another expert, David Spiegelhalter, who was also a member of the committee advising, but this time the British government, about what to do. And he seems to have a totally different view about the role of science advising and what it can do or what it can't do. And you can see that he argues that really science cannot tell you what to do. And therefore, he says, well, how can you ever follow science? As you know, in many places, even in the US, I think, governments and administrators argued that they were following science. And from there, you could see that he continues by saying, oh, well, if I know the science, I know what to do. So he continues like that. You will see, I shared my presentation with John. So if you are interested, you can have it. So you can have all the references. So what we saw, and this is just a couple of examples, but I can go on forever, showing that actually there were many voices on science, and in particular on the COVID. And it's surprising that every time that something like this happens, people are surprised and perplexed. How is it possible that scientists and experts disagree, and they don't only disagree among different disciplines or areas of expertise, but even inside different areas of expertise, experts disagree. And in the case of COVID, many were quite honest, let's say, and straightforward, saying, oh, well, we don't know. Okay, we don't know, and there is not a lot. And as you know, many of the areas of uncertainty are still, and ignorance are still with us, even the origins of the virus. Now, as I say, people are surprised every time they find disagreement, and this type of disagreement, lack of consensus among scientists. Actually, we were not surprised, because in the 80s, we were working on a problem that it is different, but it is one of the problems I took to the first meeting of ecological economics in 1997, and it's there, the date. And it was about the relation between emissions from a nuclear power station in the north of England and clusters of child leukemia. And again, what we found, it was almost the same type of disciplines. We had epidemiologists, we had radiobiological and modelers, and we had GPs, doctors of the area, and they all disagree And they disagree, as I say, not only across areas of expertise, but even epidemiologists disagree, and modelers disagree, and medical doctors of the area disagree. As it happens quite often in the UK, when there is a situation like this, they call a royal commission of inquiry, and the result was not proven. And meaning we don't know, and we don't say it's not, we don't say yes. I think we don't have enough elements to decide on these issues. And as you can see, this is a book of reporting on all the work we did, and we wrote precisely about the inquiry and the science involved in the inquiry. Now, as I said, but at that time we were not surprised either, because years before, during the 70s, and I will put it all together so you can see, a nuclear scientist at Oak Ridge, Alwyn Weinberg, perhaps you know his name. He was quite important in not only in science and engineering, but in policy and science advice from the time of the Manhattan Project until even climate. So he coined the term transscience, and for the type of problems I've been talking, like COVID, or even the relation between emissions and clusters, or contamination, pollution, environmental or health. So his problem was a problem similar to the ones we had to work on during the 80s, and that's his problem was: what can science say about emissions from a power station working normally? We are not talking about an accident like 3 Mile Island. We are talking about a power station working routinely, and health or environmental effects. And he comes to the conclusion, and this is the famous paper, where he says there's not a lot we can say. I won't go into the details, because if not, I'll use all my time, but it's interesting, and perhaps you recognize some of these names, that immediately there was a discussion in Nature Science articles about this name of transscience. And two people who participated in the debate, one is Harvey Brooks. And Harvey Brooks was an engineer. Perhaps some of you know about him, but he was one of the founder members of the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. And he said, during my time working in Vienna, where the Institute of International Studies of Analysis, they were doing energy scenarios and simulation models. And we know that those simulation models are indeterminate. And therefore, he used the term transscience to describe this type of scientific activities. And then a third person that it is mentioned is important is Bill Ruckelshaus. Bill Ruckelshaus was twice chair of EPA. And he says that when he came to EPA, he thought that he was going to deal with technical and scientific problems. And instead, he had to deal mainly with transscientific problems. And he defined transscientific in simple words, saying that a transscientific problem is one that can be expressed scientifically, but cannot be solved scientifically. Now, this is interesting, because we can spend a seminar and a year and more discussing what does it mean to express something scientifically, and also what does it mean to solve something scientifically, but we don't have the time to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that well before COVID and well before all the discussions in the 80s and 90s, people were aware that that there were these type of problems where science was necessary but not sufficient. Okay, and these were important people, and still it becomes part of what we can call uncomfortable knowledge. A knowledge that institutions, people prefer to forget, you know. So, and let me show. Still, we can see many years later, we are talking here 2008, and the idea that there are problems, and here again, what you do, EPA again, just to show many years after Ruckelshaus, we are talking about almost 30 years after, argues that, well, you put together an expert panel to advise on clean air. Well, people assume that clean air is not rocket science. And what they come is the conclusion that the quantitative evidence is high uncertain. And therefore, what is interesting here, and it is in red, is that, well, what to do in the face of uncertainty is a political problem, not a scientific one. And this is interesting. Again, it will need a lot of time to develop, but the argument is that uncertainty is part of science. I mean, it's an exciting part of science. So that's not an issue. The issue is when it becomes part of a political, practical problem of decision-making and political action. And in this case, the argument from David Golson is, how much uncertainty can a community or an institution tolerate? Okay. Now, the problem in reality, and I'm using all this because I assume that most of you are based in the US, is it has to do with the report of Vannevar Bush about science, the endless frontier, where you could see that because of the role of science for the war effort, I won't go into details, I think you can imagine, that science has become the element, the most important engine of the economy, providing economic growth and also jobs, okay? And the development of universities, and as we know them today. Now, as with economic growth, the incredible growth in science also brings its problems. And just to talk about this, already in the early 60s, Derek de Sola Price mentioned precisely that big science will bring serious problem of quality control. I won't go into details, but the fact is that he's using their big science. Big science was coined by Alvin Weinberg, which I mentioned before. And what is interesting on this is that because of the Sola Price argument and working with Eugene Garfield, he created what we call the scientometrics. I mean, the citation index is precisely a consequence of those problems of quality control resulting from an incredible growth in science and in publications and in universities and so on. Already in 1961, Eisenhower, in his well addressed. He mentioned exactly this problem. And he says, after discussing precisely how science has changed because of Vannevar Bush and big science, he says that, and I will concentrate on the last part, is the idea that that the prospect of domination of the nation colored by federal employment, etc., is serious. But he also says, in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. And here we are. Now, at the same time, there was then an emergence of what we can call popular epidemiology. And I think that many of you might remember the case of Lab Canal. Lab Canal, was about contamination of an area and health risks and so on, and how really that was dismissed by experts and the administrators, and how activists in the community, Louise Gibbs in particular, a mother in the community, took the fight and proved herself right. The situation is still around, if you remember a more recent the case of a water in Flint. So these are the elements where we can see that what is the problem? Why all this confusion about what is the role of science, and that perplexity and surprise when science cannot deliver? Well, this goes back to what we can call the model of problem-solving strategy of the modern state that emerged after 1650 with the Treaties of Westphalia. The idea that if you have a practical political problem, you translate it into a technical scientific problem, you solve that technical problem, and then you consider that also the practical problem is solved. But what happened is that that works and worked very well. As we know, science and technology were really successful, but the assumption is that problems are simple or even complicated, but not complex. And here I go. And that goes back to the origins of modeling and the modern science. And this is Galileo, Galileo saying on the idea of primary and secondary qualities, that everything that has to do with our bodies, our senses, should be eliminated. You know, economists will call that externalities. So we are externalities to the process of science. So our feelings, our sensations are just not relevant when we are doing science and modeling. So this is what we can call the first hypothesis or assumption of reductionism. Whereas complex problems that they were aware were reduced through two types of externalities. The first is eliminate the ourselves, our bodies, and second, eliminate the context. So the system that we are studying is supposed to be almost isolated and almost stable, and that is the origin of the scientific disciplines. And as I say, I mean, I don't want to be misunderstood. That was incredibly successful problem-solving strategy. It enabled, for example, small European countries to become imperial powers, I mean, through navigation and commerce and all the rest. And at the same time, you know, today with the talk, we are talking about decolonization and this type of things. Well, we can see that success was ambiguous. Now, what happens 300 years later, or something like that? We have a different idea about complexity, precisely because we realized that in the type of problems we're dealing, and the examples I mentioned, context is important, and also our bodies are important. We are important. I mean, when we talk about health, when we talk about food, when we talk about those type of things, it's just almost impossible to separate ourselves. And thus, new ideas and new definitions about complexity start to appear. And this is from the 70s by Robert Rosen. I suppose many of you, so those who have listened to people like Mario Giampietro, perhaps remember his arguments about that. But actually, complexity is not new. I mean, since we know in science, in mathematics, in physics about complexity since the early 1900s through the work of Henri Poincaré. But and the distinction between simple, complicated, and complex. But here, Robert Rosen explains this quite well. And the idea is that complexity is ambiguity. And in order to make sense, to try to understand and study complex systems, we have to deal with the multiplicity and plurality of perspectives that are irreducible to one to the other. So in a man, there is no one perspective that contains and includes all the others. Okay, so we are dealing with something with the problems I mentioned already, and you can imagine many other problems that are complex because they are ambiguous, and therefore you have a plurality of perspectives about it. Now, at that time, and we created what, the idea of post-normal science, which I just mentioned for the first time. And these are policy problems, meaning scientific technical problems that enter into the political policy process. And we identify on the basis of what I mentioned before, all the problems in which we worked since the 70s, that certain defining characteristics of this type of problems. And one is that the facts are uncertain, that there is a plurality of values, and usually they are in conflict, that the stakes are potentially very high, and that decisions are urgent. And this is why people immediately identify the post-normal approach with the COVID situation. But as I say, there are many situations before that share all these features. Now, and what we can say is that it's not only COVID, climate change, ecosystems collapse, biodiversity loss, and sustainability transitions. All of them have the features I mentioned. In that sense, we call them post-normal problems. Perhaps you are aware that other names used to this, like wicked problems, okay? But and what we argue is that in these kinds of cases, we should aim and change our focus from discovering the truth and control and prediction to something we can call quality, which is fitness for function. The idea that the knowledge input to policy decision maker should be based on this fitness for function, fitness for purpose. And that purpose is defined socially and politically. Now, as I said, it's not only this aspect that has to do with us, where the distinction between facts and values, the duality facts and values, is still it's difficult to maintain. But also there is the question of the relevance of the context. And what is the context? And the context is, I try to is that on one hand, intolerable inequalities in society, weak democratic institutions, authoritarian tendencies, and a magical idea about the role of science and society. So all these technoscientific problems are not only we are no longer in the safe and comfortable zone where we say these are the facts and these are the values, but they are embedded in societal conflict. Now, we for a long time we talked about interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, because there is a realization have been for a long time that the type of problems where we have to introduce knowledge into the political and policy process requires what it was called the orchestration of scientific disciplines. But now, and I think that with COVID, we realized that this was the case, but also in climate, the work of IPCC and in other areas, all the work on sustainability and conservation, and even ecological economics, right? And so that shows that in reality, we have discovered, that science doesn't speak with one voice. It can't and it shouldn't. But that's not enough. And as I said before, if you look at the work of International Plan of Biodiversity, you will see that it's not enough to have an orchestration of scientific disciplines, but we need what I call a choreography of knowledges. And the realization and the awareness that we have to put into practice, the idea that we have still to learn that knowledge doesn't speak only the language of science. I said I was going to talk for about 30 minutes, and these are my 30 minutes. Unfortunately, I don't think I managed to develop all the ideas, but I think that I leave you enough food for thought to ask the questions and enter in a conversation. As I said, the presentation is available for you if you are interested. And also I sent to John to distribute our entry on post-normal science for the newly published International Encyclopedia of Ecological Economics. Okay, so I'm be glad. I mean, if you have questions after even you write to me, I always answer. Okay. So I leave it to you, to the floor, to John, and I'm going to listen.
First of all, thank you very much for doing this presentation. I really appreciate it. As one of the originators of ecological economics, it was recommended to me that you be one of our speakers, and you graciously accepted, so I can't thank you enough for doing this. And I do have those files. We certainly we'll put those with the presentation on the website so that people can get those, and we'll distribute it. I think there's a few other of our members have also written for the encyclopedia, so it's good to see that's finally being published. And I'll open it up to see if anybody has any questions before I say anything. So are there any questions or comments? Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation, and a lot of history that I
Can
didn't
you
know about.
introduce? Can you introduce yourself very briefly?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Laura Schmidt-Olabisi. I'm a professor at Michigan State University, and the Department
In East Lansing.
Exactly. Yes.
My daughter went to school in East Lansing.
Oh, really? Okay. What did she study?
Well, she finished, then went to Ann Arbor, and she is a great medical doctor.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that's good to know. I grew up in Ann Arbor, so I have affiliation for that school too.
Great.
Yeah. But what I was going to ask you is, that was such a great overview, and I totally agree that uncertainty is this critical thing that is still a challenge in like every scientist I know who works in any kind of policy arena or with any kind of decision maker, this is like a key thing that is so difficult to communicate back and forth between the public and the policy world and science. And I'm just wondering if, from a philosophical standpoint or a historical standpoint, do you have any kind of insights into how that conversation could be better framed, or how we could communicate more effectively about what uncertainty is and how we should grapple with it? Because it's an ongoing problem, I think, as you pointed out. So I'm curious at your thoughts on that.
Yes, I will send John, and then he can. I have a 10 minutes video on a conference on the politics of uncertainty, where in 10 minutes I give you 40 years of experience on how that changed during the time. But briefly, when we started to work on uncertainty, uncertainty was not considered a problem. And I'm not talking about in science, okay? I'm talking in knowledge, in science for policy, okay? Let's be clear. And it was not considered because it can be handled easily by mathematical tools. So, well, what you did is you quantified, and in the same way as, in economics, creating all the machinery to put a number. I mean, that goes back to the old 1921 book on uncertain risk and profit, the Frank Knight. So, so that was the beginning. So uncertainty was not a problem because you can quantify, and as we know, bureaucracies love numbers, and I won't go into detail. What happened is that with time, and mainly because of the criticism and activism, it became an issue. It became an issue, and our work was, but like many others, and so people started to be aware that uncertainty is a problem, and that there is irreducible uncertainty, which is no longer uncertainty in the sense of night, but in terms of, as I say, complexity and indeterminacy, which is a different type of monster. So, but what happened is, if you look at the first conference on the environment, what was Rio 1992, okay, and the precautionary principle, you will see that principle 5, called the precaution of the Sustainable Development Agenda, is about precaution in the face of uncertainty. But the word uncertainty is not mentioned. It says lack of full scientific certainty. Okay, I was there. So another opportunity, I'll tell you why. But the fact is that scientists and administrators and politicians didn't want to put uncertainty together with science. And we are talking 92. But then started to appear all these books about the creation and manufacturing of uncertainty. for example, David Michaels on the role of tobacco companies and lobbies, agrobusiness and pharma in creating uncertainty in order to fight a regulation. Okay, Nomioresque's book is the same in climate. The fact is that everybody, my point is that everybody has learned how to play the uncertainty game. On one hand, what you have is, as I say, uncertainty is part of science and it's very good. On the other hand, uncertainty, it creates problems. So how will we distinguish the good uncertainty from the bad uncertainty? Okay, now, and this requires to be careful, but our idea that comes from ideas of post-normal science that I mentioned very fast is that, well, we shouldn't concentrate on uncertainty, but on quality. And the idea of quality, as I say, is fitness for purpose. And the difference between the uncertainty that relates to truth is that the truth is, well, which has become very, very topical, the post-truth and fake and all the other stuff. But the idea is we are not talking about relation between what we say and how the world is outside, because that creates other type of problem. But what we say is that we say how good is our knowledge input. And I say knowledge, not only science, but all the types of knowledge that now are being appreciated from peasants, from fishers, from indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, all the rest that we know. All that, how good is that to a purpose that has to be socially, institutionally constructed? It's part of a process. What is for? What is the problem we are trying to solve? Okay, so that's precisely. So the way to handle that is, on one hand, I wrote now a paper about uncertainty tolerance. Create a certain type of tolerance to uncertainty, but that has to be built into the institutional and constitutional frameworks. Okay. And that's a serious problem, especially now, we seem to disagree and live in so many different realities. So this idea of quality has to do with the common purpose. And therefore, we are talking precisely in terms of that knowledge input. So, and how do we do that? Well, based on this idea of complexity as ambiguity, and in terms of Robert Rosen and others, this plurality of perspectives, legitimate perspectives that are not reducible one to the other, what we have is to be inclusive, we have to be plural, we have to be diverse, and work to create all those processes into our decision-making and political process. I know it's difficult. It's what we say, a gamble. Okay, it's a gamble. And I understand we are 1 year from elections in the US, and all the, all the problems, but Europe is not very different. So when I mentioned the context about weak democratic institutions, incredible inequalities, and all those type of things, authoritarian tendencies, and the fragmentation of our common reality and our common future. These are the problems in which we have to work. So perhaps, as I say, we shouldn't worry too much about the uncertainty. But to create the processes, and I'm saying this where I wrote in 1990 with Jerry the book Uncertainty and Quality in Science for Policy. So we've been working for 40 years. But I realize now that uncertainty perhaps is not what we should aim at, explaining uncertainty, but just change the way we do things, and we accept precisely that we should replace our ideal coming from, as I say, from the scientific revolution and the modern state about control, you know, the idea that that was Descartes in the where he says that science and technology will enable to fulfill our destiny, which be owners and masters of nature. And Bacon and all that. We have to change that. It's not easy. And therefore, if we are not in the mode of control, prediction, quantification, and rational management, that's something that you recognize that. What is the role of knowledge or science even? Well, we can call it responsible anticipation. And responsible anticipation is to create robust institutions and processes that, as I say, are inclusive, plural, diverse, precisely because complexity requires that. I mean, it's not because it's morally correct, okay? It is also morally correct, ethically just, and politically efficient, perhaps. But it is also because it provides better quality inputs to societal problems. Sorry, I perhaps talked too much.
We have a couple more questions. Eric, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation today and sharing your thoughts. So when I think about these complex, big problems, I have this image of Dr. Anthony Fauci, during the COVID crisis at the peak, saying we're going to follow the science, right? He kept saying that. And there was, politicians were often deferential. They would defer to the scientists, and not just COVID, but this comes up seeming like almost every time that there's like a big challenge. Politicians want to defer to scientists and say, well, this is a scientific question, let that handle it. But I think what you're saying is it's complicated. There are all these different sources of knowledge, first of all, and uncertainty, but also that these decisions really come down to knowledge and values, and how much risk we're willing to accept, questions about people's rights, rights for the environment, and things like that. And I think when you have decision makers, politicians deferring to the science, it's because they're afraid to articulate those values. These are the values that I hold dear, and I'm going to interpret the science through the lens of these values and make this decision. But it seems like they're reluctant to do that, to go out on that limb. And I think that's a real limitation that really, it doesn't do science any favors. And we're still making those decisions through value-based lenses like economic efficiency, but we're not talking about it.
I'll try. It's a very important question, a very important issue. But what I try to show, using Eisenhower, using all the others, Harvey Brooks and Ruckelshaus and all that, you have to remember that all those people were actual Republicans. Okay, conservatives. I mean, Ruckelshaus was also director of FBI. But they were honest people trying to reflect on the situation. And they said it, and nothing has changed. in a sense. So the point is that this is a system. Okay, so there is a system to be changed. That goes back to, you know, the origins of the modern state and the constitutional regime and the regulatory system and the law. Perhaps in the US a bit less than continental Europe, where you have still the Napoleonic code on law, you see? So, so you're trying to find the truth. So what I'm trying to say is that unless we change, transform the system in order to incorporate this new awareness, everything will go on. Remember in 1984, no? There was this hole in the wall where all the uncomfortable ideas were thrown in, not to disrupt the system. Well, we have to close that hole.
There's a question in the chat and then another one by Christopher. The question in the chat is, can you say more about how you think we can better integrate science and other types of knowledge into a single decision-making system? Or can we even do this?
No, we can't. I mean, one of the main problems I see is that people try to confuse where we are at, where they want to be. So, and I have 60 years of political activism, first in Argentina, where I had to live because of the dictatorship, and I had to emigrate. And try always to understand where people are at in order to try to create a process and a mechanism that will enable to move where we want them to be, without trying to avoid violence at the end. And that is part of, I have to confess, that I hate violence, and therefore we should try to do all these processes in a situation of, well, tolerance, for a better word. But this is not easy. So part of the process of transformation of science and knowledge in this sense is not only complexity, but it's also humility. You know, it's hubris to pretend that you can solve the problems just by developing immortality or by colonizing Mars. I always say, let them go. Because if we are able to make people live in Mars, we surely can solve our Earth problems more easily. Okay? So, therefore, humilities also say that we need small solutions or resolutions. And that has to do with, again, another new word or old word for a new strategy, which is experimentation. And we have to experiment. And of course, if we are going to experiment, we are going to make mistakes, we are going to fail, and this has to be recognized as legitimate. And so this is why today I'm more interested in solving world problems. I'm interested in following, and this is part of what we can call now not only ecological economics, but political ecology. Start looking at conflicts, thousands of conflicts that are around the world, where people, activists, are creating knowledge and creating processes to try to work. And as they say in Italian, if they are roses, they will bloom. And we are in a period of a big change. There's no doubt. And I, in that sense, Yes, I think that we should think the idea, the Schumpeter idea about small is beautiful, and perhaps not. It's not only beautiful, but it's the only thing we can do.
Hey, next we have Christopher.
Yeah, and again, thank you for the talk. So I'm Christopher Schultz. I teach ecological economics at the University of Bergen, so in the UK, so it's also slightly even here. I had one question which I think relates to the previous one, which is about other types of knowledges. You've hinted at it a few times, that we have more recognition about indigenous knowledge and so on. And there's especially the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it tries to incorporate indigenous knowledge in global assessments about the environment. And I was just wondering if you have looked into that, if you are optimistic or rather cynical about these initiatives, because if you often look at the reports, it seems indigenous knowledge is locally specific and it's really hard to scale it up to the global scale. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts were on these new attempts to have global policy.
Thank you, Chris. Look, when I started to work, it was a struggle to make, as I say, not only scientists, but also administrative politicians. I worked for 25 years at the European Commission. Okay. And for those who have some European experience, know what it means. And it was very difficult to convince people that there were other types of knowledge. And the two cases that were very important for European politics and policy is agriculture and fisheries. And and the argument was that these people express values, interests, whereas the scientists were expressing facts. Well, that didn't last long because at the same time, science became technoscience and scientists became entrepreneurs. You tell me that Bill Gates or one of them are only expressing facts. They have a business. They have interest. So therefore, it became easier to show, well, tell me how to distinguish in most of the cases. So what you have is then an acceptance, and now it's recognized inside Europe in projects and in policy that you have knowledges that are not, disciplined, and they are not academic, and they are very relevant. I mean, fleets in Norway, when we go out, they take fishermen because they know where the fish are. I mentioned the case where we work in the 80s in wind scale, no? The child leukemia. Well, there are papers showing when I working there that the models, radiobiological models, the predictions were so wrong because they didn't ask the shepherds where they knew where the goats and others they fed. Okay, so I think now that discussion from a theoretical point of view, conceptual point of view, is over. And in some cases, because of even economic and political imperatives, like the case of agriculture and forestry, they are accepted. More difficult is when we are talking about local knowledge or indigenous knowledge, and what does it mean? And also it became also what we call a cottage industry for academics. Okay, so how do you express this knowledge that cannot be written or expressed in scientific terms or even verbalized? So what you have is, I'm in a sense mildly optimistic, because people have become to talk about the need to introduce art to express complexity. And this is something that is being more and more recognized. Other forms of practical knowledge, most of COVID has shown us and reminded us that most of the big challenges humanities had to face in history were not solved by science, were solved by other types of knowledge, practical knowledge and so on, and I will one more sentence. One of the main recommendations with COVID was wash your hands. And that was, the idea comes from a doctor in Middle Europe, Central Europe, Semmelweis, who realized that doctors and nurses were going from the morgue, examining bodies, to the places where the women were expecting to deliver children. And you had this type of, many died and got infected. So he said, wash your hands. And the medical profession said he was crazy. And he ended really badly. You can look at the story of Semmelweis, and precisely because the scientific ideas about medicine were totally against the idea that you have to wash your hands and you can transport the germs with you. So let's be careful. And that was one of the big mistakes also in the COVID management. If we knew that we had to close people down like they did in many places in Europe and in other places, in houses, on households with a long history of domestic violence and all type of things, you didn't have a social scientist, an anthropologist, or something like that to advise on that. They were mainly modelers, economists, and the biomedical elite. We have to finish with this type of privilege and tap on all the available knowledge, of which there is a lot.
Well, we are out of time, but first, a couple cleanup things. First, want to thank Dr. Silvio Funtowicz for just a wonderful presentation and thought-provoking and excellent seminar. We can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to do this for us, and so thank you very much. Secondly, our next seminars are coming up. Are October 13th. Kozo Mayumi will be speaking about money matters for biophysical sustainability. Then on October 27th, Mario Giampietro will be speaking, title to be announced. And then on November 10th, we will have Tommaso Luzzati speaking on economy versus nature and unsolvable conflict, empirical evidence framed within the donut economics approach. So we have a bunch of other seminars, hopefully in the pipeline, thought leaders like Dr. Funtowicz, but thank you for speaking today, and we hope you'll stay in contact with us. And thank you to all those who attended today. So thank you.
Thank you for your questions, and it was a pleasure. And I hope, well, if you are interested, just write to me. Usually I answer, okay? So all the best and good lunch for those who didn't have it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.